document was modified in any way. And then there's this HTTP equiv equals refresh content equals 60. Basically, this just says that the information on this web page could change potentially often, and so like a news website, for example, and so you should continue. The browser should take that as a cue to refresh the web page automatically every 60 seconds. Okay. So next up, we have the title. We've already talked about this. The title is simply the text that you want displayed in the web browser's title bar or in the tab's title area. Then we have this link, and we've talked about it already in the previous lesson. It's fairly simple to understand. All the attributes of the link element are basically which is the relationship. So what is the relationship of this link document to this document? In this case, the relationship is the style sheet. Secondly, href is where you can find this style sheet, or this external file. And there's the type. What type should we interpret this file as? It's a text/CSS file, right? And there are some very specific types that are available to you to use here. And then finally, there's this notion of media equals screen. We'll talk about this much later whenever we're talking about building responsive web pages. Right? So when you think of the head section, think simply additional information about the document, even referenced inside of the document, but not necessarily displayed within the browser itself. All right, so next up is the body, and you can see that takes up the lion's share of our file. And I'm tempted to talk about the body tag and what goes on inside of it. However, we're going to be spending the next 7 video lessons on this topic, so let me just talk about the goings-on of the body tag at kind of a higher level. I've used up to this point the term semantics or the term semantic meaning a couple of times so far in this video series. Simply put, when I use the term semantics in relation to HTML5, I'm talking about the implied meaning of a part of the HTML document, so that a machine, or I suppose even a human reading code, could interpret the subject matter going on inside of those HTML tags. Okay? So the hope is that by being one of the first generation of web developers to mark up our web pages using these rich semantic tags, we're laying the groundwork for developers to add semantically smart software to interpret our web pages. So, for example, search engine spiders or screen readers for the visually impaired, and maybe other ideas that in 2012 I can't conceive of, but the next generation of developers have this rich foundation to build on top of and be able to extract pieces and parts out of the documents that we mark up in this manner. So, for example, by adding a nav tag to our web page, a visually impaired person could theoretically go directly to that part of the web page using a special key on their keyboard and more easily navigate our entire website. Or a search engine bot could skip all of the design chrome around of a web page and go directly to the main articles or sections of the web page more accurately. And these are just some of the examples, again, that we can conceive of today. Over time, it's possible that by embracing the notion of adding semantics or meaning to our web pages, it'll pay off in a big way long term. I'm going to have more to say about this as we continue through the series, but for now, when you hear me say semantic meaning, you'll know everything that I'm implying by that. Okay? Alright, so let's move on and talk about HTML5 browser support. So HTML5 is relatively new, right? So it stands to reason that older web browsers are unaware of the newer tags that have been added to HTML5. This is why I want to work with Internet Explorer 9.0 or greater in this series of videos. Still, we know that it takes time for people to upgrade their web browsers, and some people may never upgrade. So what are you going to do about that as a web developer? Should you avoid HTML5 altogether and only code HTML 1.0? Well, all I'm going to say is that in this series, we're going to talk about HTML5 and CSS3. The number of issues and workarounds that you could employ to try and make HTML5 and CSS3 effects work inside of older browsers could easily make up a series of lessons on its own, and I'm going to leave that to somebody who's much more knowledgeable and talented than I am in that area. I would just say that if you're learning HTML today and you don't have a deadline in the near future for a project that has has to work on every single web browser ever created from the beginning of time, then please focus on HTML version 5. The world will catch up with HTML5 eventually, and you'll be positioned well at that point. And frankly, most browsers will ignore tags that they don't recognize, so usually, even if you look at an HTML5 page in an older web browser, it's still going to look probably okay. It may not always look nice, but it'll usually render at least to some extent, okay? If you really want to know how to make the new HTML5 tags work in older web browsers, then you might want to do a quick search on the internet for a JavaScript file called HTML5 shim that brings many HTML5 features to older web browsers. Okay. Furthermore, you might want to learn more about the notion of progressive enhancements. It's a style of building websites that begins with keeping older web browsers in mind during web development and then progressively enhancing, but not requiring, new features like those in HTML5 for the page to render properly. So if the user happens to be using a newer web browser, then great, it'll all work, and they're going to be able to take benefit from the enhanced features that you've added in. But if they don't have a newer web browser, then they can still count on the page to render itself and to be useful to them in some way. And Wikipedia is a great starting spot for learning more about the notion of progressive enhancement. There are other features of HTML5 that we're not going to talk about in this series. So in this series, we're going to be spending most of our time talking about semantic tags. We're going to spend time with the new tags that allow you to create forms to collect information from users and a lot more. Then at the very end of the series, I'm going to briefly talk about the HTML5 canvas, SVG, or in other words, scalable vector graphics, and then also embedding video using HTML5. And there are some other features that allow developers to do cool stuff, like create offline applications or to save data in a browser-based database, a lot more. However, I'm not going to be covering those in this series. I'm also not going to be covering some CSS Level 3 improvements like CSS3 transitions, which allow you to animate portions of your web page. So when you use that in conjunction with HTML5 canvas and a little bit of JavaScript, you could conceivably create simple games that replace Flash or Silverlight plugin programs. CSS3 animation and HTML5 and JavaScript with all the advanced techniques and concepts that could easily earn a video series of its own. These are definitely areas that you can pursue after so HTML5 features are being added all the time, which means all the popular web browsers. If you're curious about HTML5, you want to check out each browser's current support of that feature, then you can check out this website. It's called caniuse.com, and you can search for a particular feature of CSS or HTML5, and it'll tell you, for example, what's supported by each web browser. Now, if you're curious about the single best resource to learn everything there is to know about HTML5, there's a few places you could look. First of all, there's a version of the HTML5 specification that's intended for use by those who are creating web browsers. You might see the term user agents. That simply means web browser or some tool on the client that can interpret a web page, okay? But the version of the specification that I would recommend and refer you to is intended for web authors, or rather web developers like you and me. And so let's take a look at that. And let's go to this. So the URL might change. It's currently, as I record this video, www.w3.org/tr/html5-author/, okay? And this is called the HTML5 edition for web authors. I'll be using draft version 29. However, there might be a newer version by the time that you begin watching this video series. I anticipate that there are very few differences between what I'm looking at and what you're looking at. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But I'm going to be using this website often, and I'm going to be calling your attention to select passages as we go throughout this series. All right, so you might want to bookmark this or somehow get to it very quickly because we're going to be using it often. Okay, so let's go ahead and stop right there. We're off to a great start. Now we're going to start getting deeper into the details of HTML5 beginning in the next lesson, so we'll see you there. Thank you.
Feel that I'm full of fear, anger, jealous, all those things. How to go beyond all these things and to know this life goes through.
You don't have to go beyond all these things. You just have to stop creating those things. Your fear, your anger, all these are products of a mind which you have not taken charge of. Your mind is capable of producing joy, your mind is capable of producing fear, your mind is capable of producing anxiety, turmoil, tranquility, agony, ecstasy. It can produce anything. It is producing things that you do not want simply because you do not know how to handle it. There is no need for anybody to handle their fear.
Hello and welcome to this fundamental series on using HTML5 and CSS3 to build web pages. This series is designed for somebody who has little or no experience with HTML or CSS and wants to get a quick overview of the major HTML5 elements as well as CSS3 selectors and properties, and wants some hands-on practice as well building web pages. If the terminology that I just used is important to you, perfect, you're in the right spot. I'll explain everything in due time. So my name is Bob Tabor, and I typically talk about C#, Visual Basic, ASP.NET, and other related .NET topics on my website, www.learnvisualstudio.net. HTML5 and CSS3 are foundational topics that you're going to need to learn prior to learning popular web technologies like JavaScript and ASP.NET. So I'm excited that Channel 9 has invited me to create this series of videos. It's extremely important that you learn these concepts. Soon you'll be able to build not only web pages, but also native Windows 8 user interfaces using only HTML5 and CSS3. So it'll become increasingly a more and more vital skill beyond web development. If you're already working with HTML and CSS and you just want to learn what's new in HTML version 5 and CSS level 3, then this is probably not the right place to start. I imagine that you're looking for a what's new in HTML5 or what's new in CSS3, and that is not what this series is all about. This is going to cover material that you probably already know, as well as the most pertinent HTML5 and CSS3 additions for absolute beginners to web development. So again, your time is probably better spent somewhere else, quite frankly. Alright, so here's what I want to accomplish in this series. We're going to start by building a complete example. Now, we're not going to win any design awards, but it's still going to get us busy typing away and writing both HTML5 and CSS3. And then next I'm going to dissect the HTML5 syntax, and in the course of this discussion I hope to change any preconceived ideas that you might have about web design. Perhaps you're thinking I'm going to show you how to create beautiful web pages. That's not exactly what I'm going to do here. My focus is going to be on creating semantically correct web pages. That is at the heart of the newest features that have been added and offered by HTML5. If you don't know what I mean by that, then I assure you by the end of the series it'll become firmly cemented in your mind. Then we're going to talk about topics most developers skip over, thinking that they're not all that important, like doc types and validation and char sets, ems versus pixels versus percentages, and other geeky stuff. It's the good stuff that makes most normal people's eyes glaze over whenever you talk to them about it. And then we're going to talk about the importance of separating structure from aesthetics by separating out the work that we delegate to HTML5 from the work that we delegate to CSS3. We're going to discuss cascading style sheets and demonstrate many categories of properties that can be modified by the styles that we create. We're going to talk about the syntax, the units of measure, how to build reusable styles, and other best practices, and a bunch of other fun stuff. So my hope is that by the end of the series, you're going to be able to look at a web page that was developed by somebody else, and you'll be able to make sense of it. You'll be able to pick it apart, understand what they did, what technique they used, and you'll learn from them as a result. My hope is that this series gets you oriented in the right direction towards learning more about web development. And to that end, the final lesson in this series, I'm going to give you a list of about a dozen or so hot topics and other resources where you can continue on in your self-study. So let me give you a quick caveat before we begin. My goal is to teach you the basics of HTML5 and CSS3 in this course. However, I simply can't teach you how to make an aesthetically beautiful web page design because frankly I don't know how. When I need an attractive, beautiful web page for my website, I work with a graphic designer or find a template and then license that for my website. When I worked in corporate environments and built intranet applications using HTML and CSS, JavaScript, and ASP.NET, the company usually had a team of web designers that designed the web page background, the text, the images, and sometimes they did this by using a tool like Adobe Photoshop. After the management team approved their designs, then they would give it to the developers who would then splice up and implement that design using just HTML and CSS. Now, as a result, I got pretty good at taking somebody else's vision and their design and then implementing that in HTML and CSS code. There are many courses, there are many websites, there are many books that would love to teach you how to become a graphic designer. That is not what we're going to do here in this series. You'll be learning from a decidedly developer-centric perspective, okay? Furthermore, this series is not meant to be an exhaustive reference for HTML5 or CSS3. Beyond the standards document that all web browser vendors are encouraged to follow, I'm really not familiar with any single best source for this information. I'm sure there's one out there, but what I usually do is I know that something exists, I need a little more information about it, and then I just go out on the internet and do a search on my favorite search engine. And fortunately, there are tens of thousands of websites that post HTML and CSS tips and tricks, and I generally purchase a book, or maybe I'll find a little cheat sheet on the internet that'll help me remember the syntax of a given element or what